Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, everybody? Another week is upon us. I just want to say that I am super grateful for you all. It's so wild that I can be here right now recording this intro to this podcast with Max Lugavere, and there are just thousands of people listening. So I love doing this. I'm glad you guys are enjoying it. Please leave me feedback in iTunes if you enjoy it. It's doing super well. It even got featured in iTunes and are new and noteworthy. It's a fire podcast because you guys are telling me that it's good, and I'm having so much fun doing it. I enjoy these conversations, and this one was certainly no exception. Max is an incredible guy. If you do not know him, you should. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Genius Foods: Become Smarter, Happier, and More Productive While Protecting Your Brain for Life. He is also the host of the #1 iTunes health podcast, The Genius Life. He appears regularly on the Dr. Oz Show, the Rachael Ray Show, and The Doctors. He's contributed to Medscape, Vice, Fast Company, CNN, and The Daily Beast, and has been featured on NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, and The Wall Street Journal. It is an impressive resume, my friends, and he is also a really down-to-earth and cool dude to hang out with in person. So this was the interview that we recorded for my podcast. We had previously in the evening recorded an interview for his podcast, The Genius Life. So my interview with Max on The Genius Life will be out soon on his platform. In that interview, we talked a lot more specifically about the carnivore diet, about his thoughts about it. We went back and forth a little bit. He challenged me about it, and we had some really interesting discussion that I think will be quite enlightening. In this podcast, Max talks a lot about his personal experiences that led him to his interest in understanding how to really protect our brains. We go into lots of detail about dementia, neurodegeneration, how to prevent that, how to live a smart life in terms of protecting your brain. We talk a little bit about how both of us work to keep our brains healthy, and we get into some personal stuff that each of us do in terms of exercise routines, individual nutrition stuff, and there's a little bit of an aside partway through where I go off on a tangent about my current thinking about lipids. If you've listened to this podcast recently, you know I've done a few episodes on lipids. It is something I am super interested in, but I really enjoyed this conversation with Max Lugavere. He is such a good dude, and I think you guys will learn a ton and enjoy this as well. Again, please leave me a review on iTunes if you like it, and send this podcast to the moon. All right, so in addition to all of that, Ancestral Supplements is the sponsor for this episode. I really appreciate these guys. You guys know that I really like nose-to-tail eating. I appreciate the benefits of organ meats. Ancestral Supplements is this incredible company that sources New Zealand bone marrow and nose-to-tail organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, brain, and they put them in gelatin capsules because not everybody wants to be out of sight like me or weird like me and eat them that are not in gelatin capsules. But I love these when I'm traveling. I'll use them if I can't get the organs that I want. We know that traditional peoples, Native Americans, and early ancestral healers believe that eating organs from a healthy animal would strengthen the health of the corresponding organ in the individual. Both Max and I agreed in this podcast that we felt like supports like. And so the supplement that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the brain. I've actually been eating real brain recently. If you follow my Instagram, I've been eating lamb brain, thanks to the friend of mine on Instagram who sent me lamb brain, but they have a beef brain supplement for those of us that can't get the brain. And I think this is such an interesting thing to consume. It's probably a very beneficial thing for our brains. We know it contains factors that support the survival of existing neurons and encourage the growth of new neurons, such as sphingomyelin, which plays a role in the myelin sheath around the neurons. So check out ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. They are putting back in what the modern world has left out. You guys should also check out my newsletter, which I renamed The Insider. It is now the Fundamental Health Insider. Go to fundamentalhealthinsider.com to sign up for that. I send it out about every week. It has all kinds of cool stuff that's going on with me. I talk about an article that I think is fascinating that relates to the podcast that I have done in that week. Also, if you guys saw on my Instagram, the folks at Juve hooked me up. I got a super Juve, I'm calling it. This thing is big red. It is a full body Juve light. It is amazing. Go to www.juve.com/Paul, and they will know that I sent you, but I really like my big Juve. It is relaxing. I'm going to talk more about this in the future. I'm going to go up to Los Angeles and talk to those guys, film more of those guys, and talk to the folks at the Center for Deuterium Depletion as well. So that is coming up. Anyway, without further ado, on to this amazing podcast with Max Lugavere, my buddy. And if you check out ancestralsupplements.com, the code is SaladinoMD. All right, Max. It's good to have you on, brother.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to finally connect with you.
Same. We did it over meat, appropriately enough. We did.
We met at Bel Campo a few weeks ago because our mutual friend introduced us, and I'm so glad to have connected with you because I've been a fan of yours for a while. I think your book, Genius Life, is awesome, and that's the best title ever, by the way.
Thank you so much.
It's like such a smart title.
Well, you know, my obsession is dementia prevention, Alzheimer's disease prevention, chronic disease prevention in general, but I'm very interested in the brain in particular because my mom had a form of dementia for many years that was just traumatic, you know, to me and my family, certainly to her. But it really robbed her of her vitality for, 8 years at the end of her life. And it was just something that I don't think anybody should have to experience ever. To see a loved one go through that is just the worst thing ever. And one of the most shocking findings that I stumbled upon, and I'm sure this is not news to you, but Alzheimer's disease begins in the brain decades before the first symptom, and perhaps other dementias too. Certainly Parkinson's disease, which is the second most common neurodegenerative condition. By the time you're diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, half of the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra are already dead, right? So just like heart disease, just like cancer, I mean, these conditions don't bubble up overnight, where you show up at your neurologist's office and whoops, you've got, Alzheimer's disease. This is basically a lifelong cascade that ultimately will manifest as a disease for which there is no meaningful treatment. And I took it upon myself to try to get this information out to young people because in part I was motivated by my own ignorance. I thought dementia was an old person's disease. I was wrong. But at the same time, dementia is not a sexy topic, right? Like it's not something that young people care about. Speaking for millennials, like this is something that we all tend to think of as being something that like is maybe an inevitability of aging, what have you. So I called my podcast The Genius Life. I called my book Genius Foods. And even though it sounds kind of like a pop term, it really is, completely aligned with my mission to help get this information out to people, regardless of whether or not they are concerned about brain health. Everybody who doesn't want to be more genius in their life. So that's what it's all about for me. I mean, Genius Foods, my book, is the ultimate dementia prevention manual as far as the, best available evidence is concerned. So that's where that name comes from.
Well, I love this concept of functioning at optimal brain health all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that many people throughout the world have struggled with suboptimal brain health for a variety of reasons. And I want to ask you what you feel like is going on in the brain in these pre-diagnosis of dementia times. But I think a lot of people will mention to me they have brain fog. Brain fog is so common. This idea that we are living as humans with constantly subpar function of our brains throughout our lives is pretty striking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the latest study that I've reviewed found, it was a survey, found that 1 in 7 younger people, so people, oh man, I'm going to butcher the age range, but it was younger people. It was like, between the ages of 18 and 39, complain of memory problems, believe that their memories are not functioning as well as they ought to. And I just think that's such a shame. I mean, each one of us is heir to the universe's most advanced supercomputer. Recently scientists tried to emulate 1 second of the brain's operating power on a computer, and it took the computer 40 minutes to do that. So, this is something that it's like literally I consider it the flagship product of Darwinian evolution that each one of us is heir to. We're walking around with this. We're born with it. And yet the modern world from every possible direction functions like the Hunger Games, where it's just the brain is being attacked from every possible direction, whether it's our overly sedentary lifestyles, our lack of proper means of diffusing stress, our diets, which we could talk about, endocrine disrupting chemicals that are omnipresent in the freaking environment. It's just, we're being attacked from every possible direction. So to me, it's a no-brainer that people are sick. It's not surprising in the slightest to me that, 2/3 of adults are either overweight or obese. Half of the population is at least a type 2 diabetic, pre-diabetic, or on their way to, on their way there. And that today, if you make it to the age of 85, you have a 50% chance of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So literally, it's a coin toss. If you want to know whether or not you're going to be demented one day, toss a coin. So it's heartbreaking to me because I've seen it up close, and I've also seen, I'm not a medical doctor, but I've been in countless, I can't even tell you how many doctors' offices with my mom in some of the most storied academic medical institutions, institutions where it would be a dream if you were a physician to work, in these environments. And what I experienced every single time with my mom, I've come to call diagnose and adios. Literally, it's just nothing. It's a battery of strange tests, which I'm sure you can describe, better than I can, but not once is diet brought up in these kinds of contexts. Not once is lifestyle brought up. Thankfully now, I will, concede that the American Academy of Neurology has finally made exercise a treatment for people with mild cognitive impairment, which is sort of considered a pre-dementia. So, exercise now can be written on the physician's pad. But still, man, there's still a lot that needs to be learned, and even what we do know, it takes 17 years on average for what's discovered in science to be implemented in the clinic. So this is just an area where there's this huge knowledge gap, and I'm just trying to be out here spreading the good information, helping people make sense of what's what, disseminate the good information, dispel some myths, and help people, because you only get one life. I mean, how you live that life is up to you, but you really want to protect your brain, because once it goes, man, the treatments, as I mentioned, they're not good. Alzheimer's drug trials have a 99.6% fail rate, and it's just, do what you can to prevent dementia. That's all I can say.
Well, I think a lot of people are benefiting from the work you're doing, so that's incredible, and I think a lot of people would thank you for that. So thanks for doing what you do, my brother.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
That's awesome. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were mentioning all of those causes of things that are assaulting us is sleep as well.
Yeah.
And that's probably a great model system, because we know that amyloid plaque forms in the brain when we don't get enough sleep, right? And that these lymphatics in the brain are part of this. Did you talk about sleep at all in the book, or what do you know about sleep and these plaques in the brain?
Oh, sleep is huge. Yeah. I mean, we now know that there's a system of ducts in the brain. It's called the lymphatic system, and it's named because the glial cells of the brain facilitate its function, and it sort of resembles the lymphatic system of ducts, which is sort of the body's waste disposal, the back roads in the body. I guess you could call them. And when we sleep, essentially cerebrospinal fluid gets swooshed throughout the brain, and it cleanses the brain of these precursor proteins that essentially form the backbone of the two characteristic hallmark pathologies that have come to be associated with Alzheimer's disease. And I am sure that you in the past, I know in your work, you talk a lot about cholesterol and how you don't buy into the diet heart hypothesis and LDL as a driver of heart disease. Well, it seems to be a very similar scenario with amyloid, that it's sort of there at the scene of the crime, right? That amyloid builds up in these brains, and on autopsy, amyloid is there. It forms these plaques outside of the neurons of the brain. And for a long time, it was thought to be that amyloid caused Alzheimer's disease. But perhaps, what if it's it's building up, not because amyloid is inherently bad, but because there's some kind of plumbing problem, for example, similar to in heart disease. You could say that there's a plumbing problem in the liver, and that's what leads to, LDL basically lingering in circulation too long and then becoming sticky and tricky and causing, atherogenic plaques. Well, when we sleep is the ultimate brainwash. When we sleep, this fluid, swooshes throughout the brain and cleanses us of amyloid and tau protein, to the degree that on just one night of poor sleep, levels of amyloid in cerebrospinal fluid increase by 30% and tau by 50%. So this is a major increase in these proteins, and it's thought that having more of them around increase the susceptibility of them to misfold and ultimately clump together and form these plaques. So we need to optimize our sleep. And when it comes to sleep, there's a lot of I think we live in a world now where we're always chasing the most efficient way of doing things, right? We're all about hacking. Biohacking is obviously a huge trend, right? But I don't think it's smart to cut corners when it comes to sleep. We could go to the gym and try to optimize our time in the gym with high intensity interval training. Certainly I do that. We can try to optimize our nutrient density when it comes to our food. But when it comes to sleep, I really do think that there seems to be this magic 8-hour sort of period in which we really want to let our bodies sleep. It's a third of our lives, but it's a third of our lives for a reason, because it's just that important. So some of the ways that I like to, optimize my sleep. First of all, I like to make the most of the sleep opportunity that I have every single night. So maybe that, for me, that means going to bed earlier if I know that I have to wake up early. I'm also a big fan of blue light blocking glasses. I know they kind of sound gimmicky, and I'm actually not a huge fan of relying on technology. I think, it's good to cultivate intuition, but when it comes to sort of external, products that actually benefit health, I think these blue light blocking glasses today are very, very beneficial. They can help optimize melatonin production, or at least reduce the suppression of melatonin production that often coincides with looking at screens and the light pollution that's just so pervasive today. And new research coming out is starting to suggest that even dim light while we're sleeping actually can negatively impact cognitive function the next day. So that's where I think making sure your bedroom is really dark, just taking the leap and assuming, because it's an easy modification for most to do, that there's some truth here, that there's some causality here. I think it's worth it to make sure that your room is as dark as you can get it. Maybe it's using blackout curtains or even sleeping with an eye mask.
I like to make it as dark as I can, and so that I can't see my hand in front of my face.
Yeah.
I've heard people say that that's a good metric, and you'd be amazed at how little light you have to have. How it has to be really dark for you not to be able to see your hand in front of your face. It's a mission for me to get every place I go that dark.
Yeah, super dark. I mean, I've spent some time recently. I was camping up in Northern California, and it's amazing. Even when you can see all the stars in the sky, it's super dark. And sleeping in that kind of environment, I mean, you wake up feeling so refreshed the next day. So yeah, sleep is one of those things that's critical. And if you're on the younger end of the age spectrum, you need more sleep than 8 hours. I mean, maybe even 9 or 10 if you're an adolescent. I mean, I certainly remember growing up, I didn't want to, I could easily sleep until noon every day.
That's a big part of the growing brain process when you're younger.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about the amyloid plaques. I know there have been trials, and you know these better than I do, where I think they did monoclonal antibodies or antisense oligonucleotides for amyloid beta protein, and they got rid of the amyloid plaques, and people did way worse. That was some suggestion that when they eliminated amyloid beta plaques, that they were actually serving some sort of a protective role, and that we do see them accumulate in these neurodegenerative conditions, and there may be amyloid and tau, and there are different types of plaques and different types of neurofibrillary tangles. But generally, when we try and get rid of these plaques, these neurodegenerative conditions don't get better. So it's a very good analogy to the LDL thing, that there's something else going on there under the surface, and they maybe even be responding to an injury, and that's why we see them, but they're not causing it, from what I can tell either.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a little philosophical, but I feel like that's one of the problems with traditional medicine, is that we always take this like reductionist approach where, we love to just kind of like pick out a villain, right? We love to find the villain, because then it's important for the narrative, for one, and narrative is critical when it comes to selling pharmaceuticals. But it's so reductionist, right? I mean, like we take this simplified approach, and you're right, trials have succeeded in removing amyloid from the brain, to my knowledge, but that doesn't always coincide with an improvement in cognitive function, and it often does coincide with things that you don't want to happen, like brain swelling. And I know that there have been trials, for example, we can talk about like LDL and HDL, and, LDL is always referred to as the bad cholesterol. HDL is often referred to as the good cholesterol. And they've, this better than me, they've come up with drugs that actually can boost HDL, but they found it to not be effective when it comes to, preventing heart disease.
And there are trials like the Fourier trial, which can reduce LDL to essentially nothing. We can get LDL down to 30 milligrams per deciliter with a combination of a PCSK9 inhibitor and a statin. And people still have coronary heart disease, and still have atherosclerotic disease, and still have coronary deaths. So there's tons of stuff. I actually just released a podcast a few weeks ago where I talked to Nadir Ali on my podcast about LDL if people are interested in that topic in terms of cholesterol. But I think there's tons of evidence that the idea that LDL is initiating heart disease is wildly overly simplified and probably completely wrong. But it's the mainly held belief.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like we can be so arrogant, collectively. And I'm a huge fan of medicine, so nothing against medicine. I mean, especially if I need a doctor, if I break an arm, I'm going to the emergency room. But the same way that we try to break down food into its constituent nutrients, and we think that we've sort of mastered, our bodies. It's just an exercise in hubris, in my opinion. But yeah, that's why I think the ancestral sort of, looking at everything through an ancestral lens makes the most sense, at risk of sounding like, the appeal to nature bias, like arsenic is natural, right? I'm sure some would say, but, and that doesn't make it good for you, but still, I think it's like the best thing that you could do is live a healthy lifestyle, be active, exercise, eat a healthy diet. What that means to you, feel free to define that as you will. But yeah, you don't want to get to a point where you have to rely on medicine. And certainly there is no stigma to people who do need medical interventions, right? I mean, some people don't have a choice, but when it comes to these kinds of complex chronic diseases that are for the most part lifestyle driven, it's just kind of absurd to think that we can show up at our doctor's offices and get a pill that's going to somehow undo the decades of damage that we've done to ourselves. It doesn't work.
I couldn't agree more. And I love what you said earlier about the sad experience that you'd had, that there was no emphasis on lifestyle medicine and all of the care that you were doing with your mom. And I think that is one of the greatest failures of Western medicine today. Having just finished my residency, I've seen it firsthand. You've seen it as a patient and as an advocate for a patient. Western medicine needs to wake up and realize that lifestyle medicine is where it's at. And I don't really like to get into the conspiracy theories and stuff, but you bring up a great point that, and I see this with LDL, and I see this with cholesterol, and I see this with many things, that when we have a villain, we have a pharmaceutical, and that's $1 billion or multi-billion dollar industry. Without a villain, who makes money? Who makes money on lifestyle interventions?
Yeah.
Who makes money? No one. And I can't help but think that has to do with part of the reason that these are not more studied. And without the studies, what we know now is that physicians are kind of being taught, I think, to have a crutch that if there's not a randomized controlled trial to say something is good or bad, even if it's fasting or a dark room, physicians will say there's no evidence for that. And they never know about it.
Yeah.
And so there's this real bottleneck in terms of what physicians learn about based on what the pharmaceutical companies or what industry will fund. Who's going to fund a study about sleeping or sauna or cold therapy?
Yeah. I think it's really important to be, and again, I'm not a physician, but I think it's important to be evidence-based, but not evidence-bound. I think that there is tremendous wisdom to be gleaned from traditional medicine, from people that are out there in the wellness community that have strong senses of intuition about health and wellness. I think, intuition is highly underrated. And so I think data is great, but you have to understand that science, as much as it is a tool for asking questions and investigating answers, it's also, unfortunately, an industry. And health is an industry. And, that's not for better or worse, but you just have to recognize the limitations of it, and that we're not going to have the kinds of data that we need sometimes to arrive at the answers that we want. And so when it comes to nutrition, for example, I mean, all we have are probabilities. We're just at there's so many more unknowns than there are knowns. And when we make nutritional recommendations to people, at the end of the day, you as the listener, if you're listening to this podcast, you have to be able to take these and implement them in accordance with your own fitness levels, gender, genes, cultural upbringing. It's like, and I think these are all important parts of the equation. Everybody has to see themselves as their own N of one study and be willing to tinker and iterate and experiment.
And I think if people are living intentionally, that's the first and most amazing step. If they're doing things with consideration and they're iterating and finding the diet that works for them, it's going to be different for you than it is for me. And if they're thinking about the darkness in their room and these other things, if they're just living in a considerate fashion, if they're living with intention, they're going to advance and they're going to iterate and they're going to get better and they're going to move in the right direction.
That's exactly how the carnivore diet came into prominence. And, right? I mean, it's like, I don't know who originated it, but it's like, so people started to tinker and question and adhere to these, or adopt rather, to these diets that, any dietitian would call extreme, and not evidence-based. But the stories that are coming out from the internet, like, I mean, I know I'm friends with Michaela Peterson, who's one of the more vocal proponents of the diet. And it's just amazing. I think we have to listen to these stories and let them be the basis for future research. But I don't see the money coming to study those kinds of things anytime soon. I mean, who's going to fund it? And if it were funded by maybe the beef industry or then it would be written off because it were funded by the beef industry. So it's just, it's tricky, but again, always be willing to tinker and experiment and change your hypotheses when new information is acquired,
Yeah. So what are some other ways that people can sort of keep their brain healthy? Because a lot of people that listen to this podcast are young. Yeah. Some of them are young, middle-aged, or some of them are young, older than others. But everyone that's listening to this podcast probably cares about the health of their brain moving forward. So from your experience, from what you learned writing Genius Foods and from what you've learned on your podcast, what are some other things people can think of practically to keep their brain with as much of a six-pack as possible?
Man, well, exercise I think is crucial. Most of the when it comes to exercise in the brain, everybody talks about aerobic exercise, but I'm actually not a fan of what my friend Mark Sisson calls chronic cardio. I'm not a fan of getting on the treadmill. I think it's more important to just stay active throughout the day. I've become sort of a fan recently of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which equates to, if you're active, it could be half at least of your daily calorie expenditure. I mean, movement is just critical. It's important for mobilizing lymph fluid. It's great for lubricating your joints, and it's important for the brain. Few people realize this, but just when you walk, you create these micro alterations in your blood pressure, and that serves to push fresh blood and nutrients up to your brain. So, I mean, being sedentary, like a lake that's lost its inflow, like a stagnant pond, it's not good. You just want to stay active as much as you can. And I don't mean, getting a standing desk, because you could be sedentary while you're standing too. But whether it's increasing, the amount of time spent doing house chores or running after your cat or your kids or parking at the far end of the parking lot, being active is really important. When it comes to concerted exercise, I'm a huge fan of high-intensity interval training and also resistance training. I've written about some pretty high-level meta-analyses coming out lately about the value of resistance training on both depression and anxiety, which are different. And resistance training seems to have a really powerful acute effect, and then in the long term as well. It's also great, for metabolic health. I mean, building bigger muscles. I'm sure not everybody listening to this is on a carnivore diet. Having bigger muscles are important for many reasons: mobility, insulin sensitivity, and the like, but also as a means of disposing of glucose. Our bodies have very limited glucose storage capacity, and being able to store glucose, sugar, carbs in your muscle tissue and so that you can use them as a performance enhancing tool to support your workouts, I think that's a very important aspect of building muscle. There's a pretty good relationship when it comes to strength and brain health. Perhaps it's because bigger muscles kind of implies that we're going to be more mobile, we're going to be moving more. But again, the brain relies on metabolic health. And so by fostering insulin sensitivity, you help to reduce inflammation, and yeah, that benefits the brain. I mean, one of the sort of new theories to come out, in terms of the etiology of Alzheimer's disease, why it develops, many clinicians and scientists alike are now referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes, that it sort of looks a lot like a form of diabetes of the brain. And yeah, it's pretty startling to consider that if you have type 2 diabetes, which is in its essence a lifestyle disease, your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease increases between 2 and 4-fold. And you can still develop Alzheimer's disease without being a type 2 diabetic, but 80% of Alzheimer's patients have some degree of insulin resistance.
That is a staggering figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, I think that's the key, is the insulin sensitivity and the insulin resistance.
Yeah. We were talking, before we started rolling, we were talking about insulin resistance as being a sort of like Rosetta Stone of modern chronic disease.
I really think it is. We were talking before the podcast about some stuff that I had researched recently regarding the LDL involvement in atherosclerosis, and I came back to the insulin sensitivity thing here as well. I'll just enumerate that a little bit because it's such an exciting thing that I wanted to get out on some podcasts. But basically, the mainstream lipid hypothesis is that LDL initiates atherosclerosis. And so the more LDL particles you have floating around, the more likely you are to get injury to the endothelial wall. I don't really agree with this. I don't know. I think that you might be skeptical of this as well, but I don't want to speak for you. How do you feel about the sort of the lipid hypothesis with LDL?
Yeah, well, I feel that it's a problem when it comes to LDL recycling. I mean, the way that I've sort of written about it and conceptualized it, based on my research and having zero clinical experience, obviously, I feel obviously LDL is critically important. At different stages in life, there seem to be conflicting relationships between LDL and dementia. Later in life, it seems to be protective. Earlier in life, it seems to be maybe deleterious, but I think that the jury is still out, and it's hard to do that kind of research, certainly, so I wouldn't read too much into those studies. But cholesterol is critical for the brain. Does that mean that we need to eat cholesterol? No, because most of the cholesterol in the brain, all of the cholesterol in the brain is produced there via de novo cholesterol synthesis. I think that the problem when it comes to heart disease, and feel free to chime in here, is that the liver creates these VLDL particles. They spend a certain amount of time in circulation, growing smaller as they begin to drop off their triglycerides and cholesterol particles. And before too long, you want them to be sucked back up into the liver by the LDL receptor. But whether it's insulin resistance or inflammation or certain macronutrients, perhaps certain fat types, for example, I think, my understanding is that these LDL particles can essentially get stuck in circulation, where they get smaller, the odds of them becoming oxidized increases or modified by sugar, glycated, for example, and they become pro-inflammatory. So they become smaller, they are more easily able to lodge themselves in the endothelium. Macrophages check them out, they're modified, they're pro-inflammatory, they adhere to the endothelial wall, and that's where you start to develop a foam cell.
And I think that the piece of this that is most interesting to me, and the place where I differ from the conventional idea, is that it's about the retention of the LDL rather than the LDL itself that is the initiator of atherosclerosis. Because what I've learned, or what I understand at this point, is that the size of the LDL particle really actually doesn't matter that much. The size of the LDL particle can be a surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity, and in that case, it may be relevant. But generally speaking, the space between the endothelial cells is probably 70 nanometers, and LDL particles, when they're the biggest, are 23 nanometers. So even if you have a small LDL, 19, 20 nanometers, versus a large LDL, a pattern B, a buoyant pattern, 22.5, 22.7 nanometers, not going to make a difference how much of it's getting into the subendothelial space. But the part of it that's so interesting to me is that there's a large body of literature suggesting that the LDL particles become stickier and the subendothelial space becomes stickier in insulin-resistant states. And this is where I think we get back to that idea. I love what you said. The Rosetta Stone of so many chronic diseases seems to be insulin resistance. And I would posit, my hypothesis would be that the initiator of atherosclerosis for many people is insulin resistance, because it's not that the LDL particles themselves are atherogenic. I think that probably if we look at the numbers of LDL particles in our circulation, that progression of the LDL particle from the circulation into the subendothelial space is likely saturated no matter how many LDL particles we have, because we have a lot floating around no matter what we're doing. If we actually look at the numbers of LDL particles, we're talking 10 to the 15th. Even if you have an LDL of 200, if you have an LDL of 90 milligrams per deciliter, you still have more than 10 to the 15th LDL particles in your blood. And so the difference between an LDL of 90 milligrams per deciliter and an LDL of 250 milligrams per deciliter is 2.5 times more. But even 90 is 10 to the 15th, right? And so one is, I need to do the actual math, but say one is 1 times 10 to the 15th, and the other one is 2.5 times 10 to the 15th. So you can see that we're not really, I believe that at 1 times 10 to the 15th, the system is already saturated with particles. I mean, that's so many zeros. And I don't think it's about more particles getting in there and getting stuck, or else we would see a dose-response relationship in LDL lowering in the statin trials. And we don't see that at all. In fact, we don't see that clinically either. There's no dose response in terms of these, in terms of LDL lowering. When we lower LDL very low, it's not way less atherosclerosis than if we lower LDL a little bit. So that, to me, it's not a numbers game. It's that there is something that is making the LDL particles more sticky, and there's something that's making that subendothelial space more sticky. And that, I think, is insulin resistance. And we know that insulin resistance can cause more ApoC3, which is one of the lipoproteins on an LDL particle. That is more sticky. And insulin resistance can cause more of these proteoglycans in the subendothelial space. The thing about this whole equation that's most interesting to me, and you're very well suited to talk about this, is the type 3 diabetes in the brain and the role of cholesterol in the brain. So what do you think is going on there? I mean, I guess you mentioned it a little bit. Do you really think that there's good evidence, and I think that there might be, to show that Alzheimer's, I mean, you said 80% of people with 80% of people with diabetes
with Alzheimer's
have
insulin resistance. Yeah.
That's incredible. So what do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, I think it's, people with insulin resistance, people that have type 2 diabetes tend to have, rampant oxidative stress, inflammation. They're eating poor diets. So there's all these like confounding variables, right? Like they're probably going to be nutrient deficient. So yeah, it's hard to say, but essentially when you become insulin resistant, the blood-brain barrier can become insulin resistant as well, and that can prevent insulin from entering the brain. And we now know that insulin is important for the processing of glucose in the brain. The brain is very hungry for sugar, and so any disruption in the brain's ability to use glucose and to generate ATP from glucose is going to cause problems. And this is a big thing in Alzheimer's disease. Glucose hypometabolism, it's one of the, it's another one of the hallmark features. In fact, it's a feature that by decades precedes amyloid or tau aggregation. So you really want to make sure that you are insulin sensitive in the body. And that seems to correlate very strongly with the brain's ability to generate energy from glucose. So, staying insulin sensitive is critically important.
How do people do that?
Well,
we talked about exercise.
I think
key component.
Exercise is amazing. Resistance training, I think, is very important. There's this debate online, about what, macros and calorie balance and all that stuff. I mean, for me, I think to some degree you can outrun a bad diet. There's this whole like notion in the functional medicine world that you can't outrun a bad diet. I think exercise protects you in many ways. I'm not saying you should adopt a bad diet and then try to compensate with exercise. But you have to stay active. Exercise is that powerful. So, hitting the gym, resistance training, get a good routine going. I think that's critically important. When it comes to diet, I'm a big advocate of whole foods, unprocessed diet that incorporates both properly raised meat, fish, eggs, and vegetables.
I think it's totally reasonable.
Yeah, totally reasonable.
You don't have to be shy about that.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I spend a lot of time around. I've actually become very good friends with some of the primary researchers in the field of Alzheimer's prevention, and for one, I think it's important to get the message of how to eat healthy out to the masses. And I think there's still so much confusion when it comes to that. I've been very lucky in that I've been able to go on TV and do the Dr. Oz show and all these shows where I reach, America, like the stereotype. And for many people out there, like ketchup is a vegetable. So,
ketchup has so much sugar.
It's
highly processed.
It's mostly high fructose corn syrup.
Ketchup is diabetes in a disguise.
Exactly. What sauce isn't for the most part? Except for just a minority. But yeah, dark leafy greens I think are very important. Rush University. Some of the best epi research comes from Rush University. Martha Claire Morris, who I've had on my podcast. She's done a number of cool studies where she's found that people who eat a big bowl of dark leafy greens every day, about 1.3 cups, tend to have brains that perform up to 11 years younger on cognitive tests. Whether it's the nitrates, I know we've had conversations about, organic, naturally occurring nitrates in vegetables like arugula. You're not a fan of spinach, but, spinach kale, things like that. People that eat those vegetables, eat those greens, seem to have more youthful brains. Now, you could argue that there's confounding variables, right? People who eat more salads are probably more likely to adopt other healthy lifestyle factors and the like. So,
pretty big healthy user bias there potentially.
Healthy user bias, yeah, and I'm not denying that. But certainly when I'm eating vegetables, dark leafy greens, cooked, a mixture of cooked or raw, I feel pretty good. And I do feel that the whole thing with the carnivore diet, I feel like, we live in a time, and we've talked about this a little bit on my podcast, where there's widespread immune dysfunction, right? There's like rates of autoimmunity are on the rise, allergies and things like that. I feel like if you do not have a robust immune system, and for the purposes of a definition, we'll say if you're suffering from some kind of autoimmune condition, then it's probably worth it to try experimenting with going plant-free, or at least cutting out the most offensive plant compounds like gluten, lectins, obviously, things like that. But I feel that I have pretty good tolerance for these kinds of foods. I didn't take a ton of antibiotics growing up. Certainly I took some. Born vaginally, I get the sense that I'm, boosting my health when I'm eating these kinds of foods. And I do lab work, I follow up with my doctors and things like that. And so, yeah, I just think I think they're an important part of the equation. But I also think that, where I diverge from them is I also promote the consumption of grass-fed red meat and chicken and eggs and things like that. So I think beef is a total brain food. And so I'm right there with you. I think that, eating red meat is critical.
What about organs?
Organs, yeah, I'm a big fan of liver. I also think that it's probably worthwhile to eat brain, although I never have.
I could have brought you some, dude. Yeah. I just got some.
It actually kind of terrifies me, but I know that there's a supplement company out there where you can actually buy brain.
Oh yeah, there are desiccated brain supplements out there. Yeah, for sure. You can get it. Next time we hang out, I'm bringing you brain.
I mean, yeah, we'll cook together. I feel like that would be fun.
I eat it raw, dude.
You eat it raw?
Yeah, we're eating it raw.
Oh my God. What did I sign up for? But yeah, red meat is critically important. Grass-fed red meat has 3 times the vitamin E of grain-fed beef, so it's a great source of vitamin E. There's a good relationship between vitamin E consumption and better brain health. It's a fat-soluble antioxidant, which is good news to the brain, which is constructed of fat for the most part, but in particular of a very delicate kind of fat, polyunsaturated fats that are very prone to oxidation. The brain is a crucible for oxidative stress, so these fat-soluble antioxidants are very important.
So it's interesting because we were talking earlier about how like could potentially benefit like.
Yeah.
And I was mentioning, we recorded a podcast for your podcast before this, and I was mentioning that, I was eating some of these foods, and that so much of the nutrition we don't know about in these foods. And I'm just wondering, as you're saying that, how much vitamin E is in brain and how many of these antioxidants you might be getting from brain, because there's probably a ton of vitamin E in brain.
Probably a lot.
In, gamma, alpha, beta tocopherols, all the full range. I bet brain is an incredible superfood.
Yeah.
That's incredible. That's really interesting to think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
The brain has to be super protected from oxidative stress.
Super protected. Yeah. I mean, if you consider the fact that 25% of the oxygen that you breathe is going to create energy in a container the size of a grapefruit, right? And it's just like made of these PUFAs, with these very delicate, oxidation prone polyunsaturated fats. You just really have to chase these fat soluble antioxidants, and they're very present and easily absorbed in meat, in red meat, in wild, fatty fish and the like. So that's where I think these kinds of foods are critically important. Egg yolks also.
But you didn't want to eat my suet.
I didn't want to eat your
You didn't
suet,
want to eat my perinephric fat, bro. Don't you think that would have some of these fat soluble? I think it would. I mean, I don't know that anybody's ever tested it, but you asked me that on your podcast. Why do you eat suet? Why do you eat animal fat? And that's the reason that I bet suet is really high in vitamin E and some of these fats.
Probably.
I've got some here, man. You can have some after the podcast.
Oh, man.
I'll let you guys know if he actually does it.
Yeah. Also a big fan of carotenoids, which are pretty concentrated in plant foods, kale, avocados, things like that. But they also accumulate in the fat of animals and in fish. So, grass-fed beef, you can get, lutein, zeaxanthin in the fat, which is why sometimes it's actually it's breed dependent. But if you compare from the same animal, if you take the same breed and you feed one grain and you feed the other grass, which is what a cow normally wants to eat, you'll notice that there's more of a pigment in the fat of a grass-fed animal. Those are owed to carotenoids like beta-carotene, lutein, zeaxanthin, which the animals get from grass and then they accumulate in their fat. And those carotenoids are really important for, eye health, skin health, brain health. So I'm a huge fan of those. They act like antioxidants as well. One of my favorite antioxidants is actually found exclusively in marine life, and that is astaxanthin, which is found in wild salmon.
Salmon roe.
Yeah, salmon roe.
I just saw you posted about salmon roe today, bro.
Yeah.
That's been a big thing for me.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yes. So you eat salmon roe as well?
Mm-hmm. I eat salmon roe. Yeah, I've talked about it a lot. Huh. And, salmon roe has phospholipid-derived DHA, which crosses the blood-brain barrier more. Mm-hmm. And as you noted in your post, less mercury. It's a smaller, concentrated form of nutrients than salmon.
Yeah. Tastes really good too. I love it.
Yeah, it's really good. It's a little hard to source.
Yeah.
But I think that as people are getting more interested in it, we'll be able to find better sources for people.
Yeah, it's so good. I mean, you can go to any Japanese restaurant for the most part and get ikura, although I don't know how they source, but...
I just hope it's not farm-raised.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't want farm-raised salmon. I mean... we can talk about the omega-3, the difference in concentration of omega-3s between farm-raised and wild, but also farm-raised salmon, they're loaded with endocrine-disrupting chemicals.
PCBs, right?
PCBs, flame retardants, and heavy metals that accumulate in, grain that they then feed the fish, like cadmium. Actually, one of the top sources of cadmium in the American diet are grain products, which is a heavy metal that, impairs cognitive function, and it's just, it's no bueno.
Yeah. Talk about the heavy metals a little bit, because you mentioned that earlier when we were talking about this soup that we're all swimming in, this milieu that's kind of toxic to our brains. I think heavy metals are a big part of that. Cadmium is a source of that. I think of cadmium in grains and maybe shellfish, probably shellfish or less.
Yeah.
Where else do you think about heavy metals, and how could people go about avoiding these toxic heavy metals in the environment?
I mean, I'm glad you brought up shellfish, because I think that's an instance where the benefits outweigh the risks. And
probably.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've, oysters, clams, mussels, things like that, I feel like are so nutrient dense. They're the multivitamin of the sea. Whereas grain products are the exact opposite of a nutrient dense food.
There's no available nutrients in grains.
Yeah, exactly. And yet you're getting all this cadmium, among other things. So yeah, heavy metals, this is an area where I've just begun to sort of do a dive, but yeah, lead, cadmium, arsenic, they're just, they're everywhere.
Arsenic is in rice, right? Have you heard
rice.
of that? Arsenic in like brown rice and stuff. I mean, that's a big bummer.
Yeah, and rice products are particularly concentrated in arsenic. So, now that gluten-free has become sort of trendy, people are reaching for these products made with gluten-free grains. And if you're a celiac and you're just looking for an alternative, then, it's great. But to have this increased availability of gluten-free products, but because so much of it is made with, so many of them are made with rice flour, they're major sources of dietary arsenic. So yeah. And I was actually, for a very long time, this is an area where I've changed my stance personally. I was a big fan of brown rice. Like I would always eat brown rice bowls for lunch, even dinner. And if it were white rice, I would avoid like the plague. But if you were to put like a brown rice bowl in front of me, I would just go to town on it and probably ask for seconds. But if you don't know where your rice is being grown, you really want to, ideally avoid it, but opt for white rice. If you're in a restaurant, for example, rices grown in the south of the United States tend to be contaminated with arsenic because they used to use it in the cotton fields as part of it was like a constituent of like an herbicide or pesticide that was very commonly used down there. And it just has,
damn pesticides.
Yeah, made its way into the soil, and now they're growing rice on that same land, sucks up the arsenic, concentrates in the hull, or the germ rather, and yeah, so it's problematic.
No bueno.
No bueno.
And then lead is a big one too. And I think for lead, what I recommend people is just that they look at their drinking water and get a really good filter.
Yeah.
Anything else you think of with lead?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you because I use a reverse osmosis filter because it gets rid of everything, minerals included. But on my podcast, you were talking about the value of water from a mineral standpoint. So that's a question that I would throw back to you. What do I do with my reverse osmosis filtered water, which thankfully doesn't have any of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the fluoride, the heavy metals, but now I don't have any minerals in my water.
Right. So this is a big problem for people. And unfortunately, there's no perfect solution. I think RO, reverse osmosis, is a great solution, but I would re-mineralize it and then realize that you're not getting any magnesium from your water. And you either have to supplement or get it from your diet. As we talked about on your podcast, it's pretty hard to get magnesium from your diet in any way, shape, or form. I mean, animal foods have some, plant foods have some. In my opinion, the plant foods are pretty poorly bioavailable. But I think if people are if they're using RO water, they really need to think about their minerals in a special way. And there are products that I'm familiar with, like Concentrace from Trace Minerals, that will remineralize the water somewhat, but you're also not getting anything. You're not getting any lithium. There's a lot of things in our water. So I haven't figured out the perfect thing. When I was in Seattle, there was a spring. So it was a artesian well, which is below the bedrock of the earth. So it's actually just a sort of really deep spring, and it's tested. And that's probably a great solution, but it's hard for people to get spring water all the time. And then I'm not a fan of plastic, so I wouldn't store my water in plastic ever.
Right.
I don't want to get spring water in like a plastic jug, no matter what type of plastic it is. So what I've settled on now in San Diego is one of these Berkey filters, which is kind of in between, right? It's not going to take out all the minerals. It's a pretty darn good filter. And there are fluoride and arsenic post filters. So you can get a Berkey that will remove fluoride, arsenic, and mostly everything else. It's probably going to remove some of the minerals, but it might leave a little more in. And that's kind of my compromise right now.
Yeah.
There is spring water down there in San Diego, but I just haven't been able to figure out how to get it. So I think RO is a great option because it's super clean. You just need to realize you probably want to re-mineralize it with like trace mineral drops.
Yeah.
And then just make sure you're getting enough magnesium and other stuff from other sources.
Yeah. I do actually take a magnesium supplement. I take magnesium glycinate.
Not a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's just a tricky thing. And this goes back to the thing you were talking about earlier. And I think this is really the key. I love the concept of ancestral wisdom and the ancestral mirroring in our diets and our lives. I think that the more we do that, even though people might argue that it's antiquated or it's an anachronism, I think there's so much wisdom in that. And clearly with water, we're separated, right? It's like when you were out camping, you're going to get water from the stream and you're going to filter it so you don't get giardia, but you're going to get fresh flowing water. It's going to be really good water, right? And we're just so separated from that in so many ways. And so I think that that's what I keep coming back to in my own life is, how do we live more like our ancestors in a modern world?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was thinking I might mention when we did your podcast, but I didn't have a chance, was that I almost don't even like the word carnivore diet. And I've almost just started thinking about it as an ancestral diet. And that sort of opens it up for more interpretation. And I think that's really the metric or the ethos that I want to pursue in the future. Like, what is the most ancestral diet? How do we define that? You know, what is the diet? What is the overall lifestyle in every way that we can live that will get us closest to what our genetics want? What is the most congruent way to live? And so for me, what I've interpreted right now is that a no-till carnivore diet is probably the most ancestral diet, but there's lots of interpretation there. And I'm always learning about that too. But I love that concept of just trying to do as much as I can. And I think we see eye to eye on this in all areas of my life from an ancestral perspective.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the modern world has mutated to such a dramatic degree, and we're sick, we're tired, we don't feel good. And I just think, we deserve better, and when it comes to ourselves, but then just looking at our loved ones, like, I don't want to see the people that I care about suffer and wither and become frail and get sick and die. I've seen it, and it's horrible. And, there's got to be a better way, and maybe the science will catch up, and we'll arrive at real concrete answers within our lifetimes. But, if it doesn't, I think that it's wise to hedge your bets and to not give the benefit of the doubt to these industrially, processed foods, the agrochemicals that now saturate the food supply. I take this stance in my book, in Genius Foods, where the less time a product or a food or a medicine or a supplement has spent on the sort of market, the more skepticism we have to approach those products or those foods with. Too often there are way too many instances throughout human history where, and especially in recent human history since the industrial revolution, where products have been foisted upon people, millions of people, only later to be determined as being deleterious to health. We can look at lead-based paints, which up until just 1978, right, were used in our homes, creating house dust, where our children have been breathing in this toxic heavy metal, right, impairing cognitive function. We can look at asbestos in our building insulation, which was, used even up until I was a child. I feel like they were still using it. So many other instances, partially hydrogenated oils, right? I mean, I think grain and seed oils like soybean oil, canola oil, these are going to be ultimately determined to be as toxic as many of us in the ancestral community now have, promote that they are. But I mean, it's just every day it seems like there's a new thing that's like we now have to be worried about, right? The compounds in plastic. I mean, these compounds that are used to make plastic water bottles are not inert. They leach into our food. New research has come out just over the past month or two about chemical sunblocks. I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I've been in a dermatologist's office where they tell you to slather this stuff on. We now know that they, when used on humans in accordance with their instructions, they enter blood at, frightening levels. Okay. And these compounds are able to mutate and turn into potentially carcinogenic and neurotoxic compounds. And they're no longer generally regarded as safe, right? The onus has been placed by the FDA onto the manufacturers of these sunblocks to come up with the proof that they are actually safe, because there's just no evidence that they are. And yet how long have they been in our drugstores lining our supermarket shelves? And we put them because we're told to by our most trusted authorities on ourselves, on our children, on our loved ones. I mean, these are endocrine disrupting chemicals that we're putting on our freaking children when they're developing, right? Because the sun is so bad for them. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on about this, but I just think it's like, not to sound conspiratorial because I'm not, but you just can't argue with the facts, man. And so I think it's really, you got to become a sleuth. You got to be a detective. You got to look out for your loved ones. And, I don't care if it's just like, again, be evidence-based, but don't be evidence-bound. Some of these people like in the evidence-based community, like they're more evidence Nazis than anything else. I feel like if we're talking about recommendations that are safe, and that they pass the test of logic, then I think they're worth giving a shot, and taking the trust away from, like, I don't know, don't trust
don't trust the man.
The man. No, I don't know.
In medical school, we're told that like 50% of the facts we learn are wrong, and I would sort of extend that statement to say 75 to 80% of what we see in the grocery store, what we're exposed to in our lives is toxic.
Yeah.
And I love what you said. I think people just need to be woke.
Yeah.
And they need to be aware that we're exposed to toxins all the time. And we're being pushed further and further away from ancestral norms.
Yeah.
Which I think is bad for us.
Yeah.
You were telling me before we did the podcast that you've been getting into some other kind of ancestral stuff, that you've been playing around with cold stuff and heat stuff. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously big fan of exercise, which is a form of hormetic stress, really, really good for the body. But hot and cold. I mean, saunas, I'm a huge fan of. Really great research out of University of Finland has found that habitual sauna use is related to a pretty dramatic risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, along with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, and the like. I really think actually one of the primary villains in multiple forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, is vascular. It's vascular dysfunction. And sitting in a sauna, it's really good. It's sort of like an aerobic exercise mimetic in a way. It's really good for vascular compliance, lowering blood pressure, lowering inflammation, everything. And I trust that observational research out of Finland, because in Finland, well, for example, in the United States, and this is sort of a good learning lesson when it comes to this kind of research, in the US, you could say if you use a sauna regularly, clearly you have a gym membership, right? And you're sitting in the gym, you're at the gym 5 to 7 days a week, and that's what's responsible. Maybe that's what's responsible for the risk reduction for dementia. But in Finland, sauna bathing is as common as taking a shower. And this is where the research has been done. So Finland is the sauna capital of the world. So I put a lot of stock in the findings that come out of there. And so huge fan of that. I try to do that 3 to 5 times a week.
Yeah. What do you think the prescription is for that? I know, is this Jari Laukkanen's work?
Yes, that's him. Yeah.
And what do you think? I remember they were saying, what do you think the prescription is for people a few times a week at like 170 degrees for maybe 10 to 15 minutes?
I think it was, I want to say 3 to 5 times a week. But there was a dose effect, So, I mean, even once to twice a week, there was I believe it was, don't quote me on these figures, but I think it was something like a 35% risk reduction, and then it shot up to 65% for 3 to 5 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah.
And those also detoxify going back to like the estrogen mimetics, you can sweat out metals. So I think it's mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. Don't quote me on that.
Well, I love that you brought that up because there's a lot of people, again, I call them evidence Nazis, but that'll say that saunas don't detox you. But actually, your sweat is a major means of excretion of many of these compounds, phthalates, BPA.
Yeah. And I've seen evidence that the concentration of heavy metals in the sweat is higher than in the blood. So there's clear evidence that we can detox even heavy metals and the phthalates in the sweat.
Yeah, these plastic-related compounds. So huge fan of sauna use. Cold water immersion, I think is great. Just for mental acuity. I do it pretty regularly.
How do you do that?
Well, actually, it's kind of hard to find a place to do that in Los Angeles where I currently live. But when I was in New York, I was doing it 3 to 5 times a week because
Just in the Hudson River?
Not in the Hudson River. No, I wish. I mean, that would be cool. Although talk about like
toxic.
Yeah. No, I had at my gym there was like a cold plunge and the water was 50 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's an amazing gym.
Yeah.
No gyms have cold plunges.
No gyms.
All right.
It was great. But yeah, in terms of reducing inflammation, there is no good evidence on cold immersion as it relates to Alzheimer's disease specifically. But there are some interesting brain changes that occur. As well as, in the periphery, the reduction in inflammation is worthwhile. Brown fat, I think, in terms of fortifying metabolic health, we can cultivate brown fat. We can activate that brown fat with, cold water immersion. We can boost levels of norepinephrine in the brain. So for that focus and acuity. But actually, there's also really interesting research that suggests that the epicenter of norepinephrine release in the brain, the locus ceruleus, might actually be one of the first places affected by Alzheimer's disease. It's been called sort of ground zero for Alzheimer's disease. And I don't know, we need more research for sure, but I kind of feel like maybe doing that cold plunge, getting, sort of a workout for that region of the brain, especially when our lifestyles have become so sedentary and we're just so, not getting, not working out that region of the brain. So,
just not radical anymore.
Yeah, we're just not radical anymore.
We need to be more radical. I mean, I love jumping in cold lakes is invigorating. Like, I love it. I miss it.
Yeah, for mood, I think there's a researcher, Rachael Raison, I believe his name is.
I used to work with him.
Really?
Yeah, at University of Arizona when I went to medical school, I worked with him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
But talk about his research.
I've been meaning to reach out and get him on my podcast, but yeah, I think he's done some cool studies with, I want to say cryotherapy and major depression. I think I would have to actually review it to speak, to an informed degree on it. But I do know that he looks at that and he has published results of trials where he's used some kind of cold immersion with major depression, and he's found the effect size to be pretty significant, on par with like what you would expect from a pharmaceutical, but without any negative side effects. There are a number of case studies that I've seen where winter swimming in the ocean has really dramatically helped people with major depression.
Are we going swimming in the ocean this winter, Max?
I'd love to, man.
Let's go.
I love it.
I'm gonna get you surfing, bro.
I feel like I'd probably kill myself. I'm not the most coordinated, I don't know. I've never been an athlete. I don't play any sports.
I don't buy it.
I just go to the gym and I like to just be a meathead in the gym.
Well, tell us, because you talked about exercise and then we'll wrap up because I want to be respectful of your time. Tell us your exercise regimen. I think when you were talking about that, you said you do some weightlifting and some high intensity interval training. I think it's good for people to have the practical stuff. What do you do in the gym now?
I love to lift weights. I know it sounds like I'm a meathead, but growing up, I became really interested in bodybuilding. I was sort of an introvert, computer nerd, comic book, fanatic, and I saw weightlifting and supplements from a young age as a means of, as sort of like a gateway to transcend my insubstantial self at the time. I was just not an athlete, and I gravitated to the gym, and I found some forums online. This was in high school. So I was a very early adopter of this stuff. I read The Ketogenic Diet by Lyle McDonald when I was 17, and I started implementing some of those findings. I wrote my high school senior thesis on creatine. So, I mean, needless to say, when I go to the gym, I do kind of It depends. Some days I'll do like an upper body, lower body split, maybe like a push pull split. Some days I'll just go in and kind of like lean on my, intuition and, what muscle group is feeling the most, I don't know, the strongest or the most coordinated that day. But yeah, I like to lift weights. I kind of keep my rep range in the, 10 to 12 arena.
What sort of movements do you like? Do you deadlift?
I don't deadlift. I know that's kind of sacrilegious to say. But I just feel like my body mechanics don't lend themselves to that, or at least, maybe I haven't really been trained, but I've over the years, I've like tried to do it. And I actually had a low back injury a couple of years ago, from squatting improperly. I just feel like I've been a victim of that, reduced glute activation due to our, chronic sitting. And one day I was in the gym and it was actually back day, but somebody was a friend of mine who I was working out with was doing squats, and he was like, "Max, come over, do a set." And like, I didn't warm up. I was like, "No, man, I'm good." And he was kind of like pushy, and I was like, "All right, there's only a 45 on each side." And so I went and I did a set, and I kind of like, I feel like I just like, I don't know, compressed a disc, and my back really hasn't like been the same since then. So I don't do a lot of like load bearing stuff. So I'm not squatting, really. I don't do deadlifts. The one move that I've found for lower body that really seems to help and to not aggravate, my lower back and all the muscles in that area that seem to become inflamed with different leg exercises is sort of like a reverse lunge with a dumbbell held overhead, like an alternate, I don't know the name of it, but it's like holding a dumbbell overhead in one hand, which because your shoulder, it basically, you have to maintain an upright sort of body position to keep that dumbbell overhead. And then I do a reverse lunge.
So you step backwards.
Instead of
stepping forward with lunge.
Yeah. Those I find to be very effective in terms of like building glute strength, leg strength, and not aggravating my back the next day. So that's kind of where my like leg workouts are. I wish I had a more impressive like leg routine, but when it comes to upper body, yeah, I'm doing pull-ups and I bench. I love to use machines occasionally. I kind of like, have like more of a bodybuilder routine when it comes to like upper body.
What about for high intensity stuff?
I love battle ropes.
Sweet. Those are awesome.
Yeah, those are awesome. And then the assault bike, whatever that is,
That's
the air
brutal.
bike. Yeah.
That thing is fucking gnarly. Sorry.
I love it. I love it though. Yeah, I feel like, again, I'm not on the carnivore diet. So when I do those kinds of high intensity glycolytic, anaerobic, moves, I feel like it provides a buffer for me to maybe be able, give myself a little more leeway when it comes to higher starch foods, like sweet potatoes occasionally, or, as much of a real food advocate as I am, I mean, sometimes, I'll go for like dark chocolate, or I showed you, I discovered these epic grain-free pretzels. I haven't had a pretzel in a decade. And so now I'm like, I've got this new like, grain-free pretzel.
But we noted they were made from cassava.
They're made from cassava, which is pure starch.
And I was going to tell you about cassava, but
yeah. Maybe not. Yeah. Do as I say, not as I do. No.
So when you do your high-intensity intervals, how often do you do them and how long do you do them for? Like, how do you prescribe it? Just for you. I mean, maybe not translatable for everybody, but just as a basic.
I go off of like my intuition. So, I mean, usually it's 3 to 5. It's probably about 3 times a week that I'm doing high intensity interval training. Sometimes I'll make a whole day out of it where I'll go to the gym and I'll just build the day around battle ropes, some upper body high intensity stuff, and then the air bike. Because the muscle that you're working out, glycogen is only available to the muscle that is being worked out, right? You can't like borrow glycogen for your leg muscles from your arms or your shoulders. So, I like to do high intensity interval training that sort of, includes both my lower body and my upper body. And usually that'll follow my weights when I'm doing like a resistance day. And then I'm not, I don't have that rigid of a routine, I don't.
Which might be an awesome thing. That might be a really good thing.
Yeah. I mean, I go to the gym and I give it like a really concerted, concentrated effort for about an hour where I'm doing pull-ups. Some days I'll do just an upper body day where I'll do pull-ups and then I'll do bench and then I'll do sort of like isolation moves to support those, or like maybe some incline presses or dips. But then other days, maybe I'll do like a back day or a chest day. It really it totally depends on how I'm feeling.
Have you heard of high intensity repeat training? I was recently hanging out with Brad Kern. Do you know Brad?
No.
Brad's a good guy. He works a lot with Mark Sisson. He's written books with Mark, and he was telling me about high intensity repeat training. It's something I've been messing around with recently. The idea with this is that you do intervals, but you give yourself plenty of rest between them. So that a lot of times in the past, I was doing Tabatas, kind of these like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, times 8 for 4 minutes, and it's brutal.
Yeah.
And he was saying that there's a new idea that perhaps we should do 20 seconds max and then give ourselves like 3 to 4 minutes to recover completely.
Yeah.
It almost sounds a little more ancestral to me.
Well, I think the question that I would have is then like, to what degree is your phosphagen system reloading during that time? Right. Because you want to make sure that you're working out like your glycolytic pathways, right? And so for the first, I don't know, I think it's like 10 seconds of a high intensity interval, you're really just using creatine. And it's only after that that you're using the stored sugar. But then there's a certain window, and I don't know what it is, but where the creatine basically kind of regenerates, and then you can kind of like become more efficient, I think, timing your exercise in a certain way where you can work either system. You could become more efficient with the phosphagen system. You could become more efficient with the glycolytic. So I don't know.
Yeah, actually, I wonder about that.
Yeah.
I think that personally, I've had a tendency to overtrain. And so I've been kind of experimenting with it recently with like intervals, hitting the punching bag and doing kicks on the punching bag and doing slightly shorter intervals with a slightly longer rest interval between them. And I kind of like it. It just leaves me feeling a little less depleted when I leave the gym. I think oftentimes we get addicted to that like over depleted feeling when we leave the gym, and maybe that's too much, but who knows? And I think going back to the ancestral stuff, I just wonder how often we would have just been crushing ourselves. Probably not that often.
Probably not that often. You're right. Yeah. So that's why I like to do kind of like, to embody that balance, to go to the gym. I think an hour is fair, like to go and give it like, your all for an hour and then spend the rest of the day in recovery mode, basically.
Chill out.
Yeah.
Max, it's been amazing.
Paul.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks for having me. This was such a great chat. Man, we covered so much.
Where can people find your kick butt stuff?
My kick butt stuff. Definitely go check out my book Genius Foods, which is available everywhere books are sold. Come say hi on Instagram at Max Lugavere. And then I have my own podcast, which is called The Genius Life. So, wherever you listen to podcasts, look that up.
You have a website?
maxlugavere.com. I have a blog where I have some articles, but I don't update my website that frequently. I'm very active on Instagram, and every week I put up a new podcast episode. So
yeah. And we did one today, so
yeah, it's gonna go up soon.
I'll have one on Max's. I'm pretty stoked to have an episode on the Genius Life soon. And you guys should check out Max's Instagram. He does a great job of producing like really good infographics and stuff that really makes it all really digestible. So he's a pro in the Instagram world. So my last question for you, because I'm realizing that to be a good podcast, every good podcast has like their signature question.
Signature, yeah.
So I was thinking this. I was like, man, I don't really ask a signature question, but I got one.
Is this the first time you're asking?
This is the first time I'm asking.
Wow,
a
so you came
question.
up with it over the course of this afternoon. That's amazing.
Yeah, well, when you wait till the question, it's not that amazing.
Okay.
All right. So what is the most radical thing that you have done in the last week?
Oh my God, in the last week? What's the most radical thing that I've done? Wow, I feel like I'm not that radical of a guy. Well, I went up to Arizona this past weekend for a health and wellness conference called Mind Body. It was Mind Body Green's Revitalize conference where I got to speak. And God, this sounds so lame, but I met like a girl recently in LA who I thought was pretty cool, and I invited her to come with me. We had known each other for a week prior to my inviting her to like join me at this conference, and she came with me and we had a really good time. Normally I wouldn't have done something like that, but I felt like, why not just like share the conference, get to know this new chick, and that's it. That's probably not in the domain that you were expecting it to come from, but I feel like you got to live at the edge of your comfort zone and say yes to things and be open. And I'm trying to embody that in all aspects, whether it's health, research, my own learning and education, or just connection with other people.
Personal life.
Personal
I love it.
life, yeah.
Thanks, Bonnie. That's amazing. That's a great answer, dude.
Yeah.
I love it. If you were just like, if you were at the edge of your comfort zone and you were like, oh man, I'm excited about this. That's radical.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? I'm like, I've been like, I get to go to these things all the time, and they're like really great opportunities. And, like you're around such cool people, and I kind of felt like this girl was like really cool, and that she would like gain from it and learn from it and enjoy it. So I mean, the question was about the past week, and so that's like what I did over the past week.
That sounds amazing to me. That sounds amazing to me.
Yeah, well, thanks, man.
Thanks for coming on, dude. Thanks for coming on. You guys, thanks for joining us. You know what to do. Stay radical. All right, you guys, thank you so much for listening to that episode. I really enjoyed that conversation with Max. I think you're really going to like the one that we did for his podcast. Again, he challenged me on a lot of stuff. We really, I think, pushed the envelope in terms of ideas around epidemiology, minerals, and I won't speak for Max, but I think that he was surprised at what he heard, and I think that he was pleasantly surprised, and he's a very open-minded guy, so I'm hoping that that he will, appreciate the carnivore diet more in the future. I think he does. So check out ancestralsupplements.com. I appreciate what these guys are doing to bring the organ meats to more people. Check out my newsletter, The Fundamental Health Insider. Be an insider. Be in the Cool Kids Club. Check out Joovv, www.joovv.com/Paul. I really like my light, guys. I get relaxed. My REM sleep gets better. My deep sleep gets better. Raise my testosterone. I'm going to talk about more in the future. All right. I enjoy this. I appreciate you all. So much gratitude. Stay radical.